Good morning, everyone. And we will get started here with our product photography tips for e-commerce webinar. Thanks for joining us. I hope you had a great holiday. We're still kind of in the thick of it, so we thought we'd just keep these webinars going. Maybe you have a little bit more time, maybe you have less, but we want to continue to provide some different support and um, inspiration and technical expertise to help you with your digital marketing. So just a little bit of background on the digital service squad, which is myself, and we're joined by Sam Evans as well from our digital service squad
Good
team.
morning.
Welcome, Sam. And the digital service squad is part of the Digital Main Street program, which of course is brought to you by the FedDev Ontario government, the Ontario BIA Association, the Toronto Association of BIAs, and here in Simcoe, South Georgian Bay, the program is managed by the Small Business Enterprise Center, and with the additional support of the County of Simcoe, the town of Collingwood, and the town of the Blue Mountains. That's a mouthful. But if you haven't got in touch with your digital service squad, there's information about the whole team. There's 5 of us, and that's available at enterprisecenter.ca digital service squad. You can follow the Enterprise Center at SGB_SBEC. That's on Instagram or on Facebook. Be Fresh Media, and book your consultation. That's the main thing. If you haven't met with your service squad or had a consultation, go ahead and book that whenever you can. There are grants available through the Digital Main Street program for downtown Main Street businesses, and we can help you navigate that program. You want to get on that soon, though, because the deadline to apply is December 31st, today being the 28th. There's not a lot of time left. So be sure to get in touch with us, and we can help you out with that. Sam is going to put a link to the PDF, which is on Google Drive, if you don't mind, Sam.
Thank you.
In the chat. And as always, with our webinars, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, or you can message us directly in the chat, and we'll answer those as we go. So as I mentioned, we'll have the link to this PDF presentation there, as well as the the link to the consultation. We'll put that in there as well. We'll get through our photography tips for e-commerce webinar. My apologies if you do hear my son in the background. It's the holidays, kids are home. I'm sure everyone is dealing with this right now. So moving right along, talking about e-commerce. I wanted to kind of set the stage for our webinar today. There's a lot of ways that you can get creative with your product photography, but specifically what we want to feature here is the ability to create just clean white background images for your e-commerce. And there are different ways to do that, and I want to give some tips and tricks on how to accomplish this very kind of standard look, which is great for whatever your application for Shopify, Facebook Shop, your WordPress e-commerce website, whatever you need. This is a perfect option, a perfect way to display your products in a way that's very clean, and just works. It works well across all platforms. So with that in mind, the first thing I want to mention, same thing with our video webinar, is that, we are going to talk about some gear, some different equipment that you might need. But when it comes to taking the pictures, chances are your phone is going to do a perfectly adequate job. So, I don't often recommend upgrading to a DSLR or a mirrorless camera or anything really expensive, because your phone can take great photos. It can actually take, higher resolution photos than we need. And we're going to talk about how to get those settings kind of dialed in for your product photography. So moving right along to some equipment that you might consider picking up or getting to just get you started. So this will depend on the size of your products that you're selling. But when we want that clean white background, we start with the background. So a piece of white paper or cloth, you can get them in a roll maybe, depending on the size. This image here is potentially a bit overkill. I mean, for a mug, do you need a roll that goes all the way to the floor? No. You basically just need enough space to fill the frame, or enough material to fill the frame and get that white seamless backdrop. So Bristol board or poster board is a really cheap option as well, easily attainable. You find it at basically any, you can find them at Walmart, or, like an art supply store. And they come in different sizes. So like a big kind of poster board is great. You line it up and you can just like tape it to the wall, and use a table as your surface, and then just away you go. The next option would be a photography softbox. And I'm going to talk about how to kind of use those in a few slides. But essentially, this is for a perhaps more permanent setup. Maybe if you've got a lot of products that you want to get through, and you've got sort of a dedicated space that you can put one of these things. The great thing about them is you can just put lights right up to it, and it softens them, so you don't get harsh shadows. And I find they often come with a backdrop. You can see in this photo, I just grabbed that from Amazon, and they often come with these cloth backgrounds that you can lay down for different colors, but they're often just really crinkly, and they're like a plasticky kind of material. So the one I have, because I own one, I've never even tried to get the wrinkles out of it or use it, because it was just kind of useless to me. The Bristol board solution was perfect. It fits right inside my softbox, and it gives me that really clean look. And the thing is, if you scuff it up, you can always flip it over. You can put it in the recycling bin and grab a new one. They're like, less than $1 a piece. So a really great option there. Depending on the size of your products, if you do have bigger items, like furniture, for example, then you can, you might want to invest in like a bigger roll of paper or cloth. But again, cloth can get lots of wrinkles. But I'll show you again in a few slides how we can deal with some of those issues. So that's the background, basic white, pretty simple. And setting it up like that. Actually, one thing I'll mention too is like the clips. I often just use tape, but you can find a lot of these little clips at, you know, your local dollar store, your hardware store. They come in a variety of different sizes. They're pretty handy just to like clip things, even lights or reflectors, and they're really inexpensive. So there's going to be a lot of this show and tell going on. I got a lot of gear piled around me to pull out and kind of show off here. But moving along, so lighting is also really important, especially for getting that that pure white background. You will probably find that you might go to take that photo and your phone will just kind of try and balance out the image, and it's going to look very gray, that white background. What's going to help is lighting. And again, you know, it doesn't have to be terribly expensive. I'm giving you some options here you can find, again, at your local hardware store. Inexpensive, like these clamp lights, for example. They're super cheap, pretty effective. You can get, you know, just regular bulbs. This is like a floodlight with some diffusion on the front of it. So again, it's not terribly harsh, but I mean, it is still quite harsh. But you can also just get like some of this diffusion fabric and put this in front of the light so that it kind of breaks it up, softens it a lot, so that, again, don't get too many harsh shadows.
And for those out there that are thinking, well, we're doing photography, my phone has a flash, we're talking about using constant light, which is great for this sort of setup because you can see how it looks in camera before you start messing around with trying to expose for the 1,000th of a second that flash is going to fire for. So it's handy to use constant light because you can see if you need to move your object closer, your lights closer to the object, all that sort of stuff. But the one thing with using, you know, the kind of lamps that you have in your home, which is all you need, just make sure that they all have the same bulb in, because the color temperature from each different light source will be different. If you're relying on daylight coming in from the window, you don't want to be using like a cold tungsten light on the other side of the object, because then you're going to have sort of two halves lit differently. So try, like, just make sure that they're all at, you know, 5500, whatever it might be that you have in your current bulb arsenal.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's a great point that I kind of skipped over, was the natural light being kind of your first option. So in the photo here, we see that they've set up next to a window. You can see they've moved it quite a bit away from the window because it looks like there's some, you know, pretty harsh sunlight coming right in. So they've moved it off to the side so that they're still getting a lot of that natural light, but it's softened up with the distance there, and it's a really perfect setup and effect. If you're doing that, as Sam mentioned, your light bulbs in your home are probably more of the tungsten, you know, the warm color light bulbs, warm temperature light bulbs, which are a little more, they're more yellow. And yeah, when you mix the yellow and the kind of natural white sunlight, or bluish kind of tone sunlight, it doesn't work very well together. So if you're using natural daylight with the window, you'll want to turn off your overhead lights, anything in your home. And then if you are projecting additional light, yeah, make sure that you get like a 5,000 Kelvin light bulb, which again, I'm super stoked that in the last couple of years, I've noticed that they're more and more available at hardware stores. This one is like an LED that is like really nice and soft, not too harsh, and you know, just from hardware store. So it's pretty sweet.
Yeah, Canadian
Um,
Tire have a good selection.
yeah, that's it, right? Canadian Tire, Home Hardware, anywhere you buy your light
The
bulbs.
the other thing with daylight, shooting on a day like today is perfect because, you know, the next hour it's going to be all the same. But just bear in mind that as a shadow goes over the sun, that's going to change the color temperature entirely, as well as the amount of light that hits your actual object. The aim of the game, like what we're trying to set up here with this product shot, is to have even light over the whole subject without kind of a big harsh shadow coming across one side, or if you've got, you know, something like a chair, it being lit, you know, all from one side so that one side of it is dark, kind of thing. So, you know, normally we do sort of 3-point lighting, which is where you have a key light, which is like your hottest light. Then you have a fill light that takes away the shadows of that key light, and then a light at the back, which is normally called a hair light, which kind of stands it out from the background, which is obviously more complicated than you need to be going into for a cup. But that's what we're trying to recreate here, is just an even light throughout.
Yeah, and a reflector can be a pretty handy piece of equipment as well, where essentially what you're doing is you're bouncing some of that light from, you know, in this particular case, you've got the table set up next to a window, so there's sunlight coming in from one side, and then you can bounce that light back off of the surface to, you know, illuminate the other side, and also it can reduce some of the shadows as well, so that again it's that more soft look, lit from both sides a little bit more.
And that's why we're encouraging you to use white for your Bristol board or sheet setup, just because that's going to naturally bounce light around, as well as
Sure.
you know, if you were using a green sheet, it's great for chroma keying, green screening, but that can throw green back onto your object in this sort of setup, and you don't want a cup that's got one side of it that looks kind of green.
Yeah, that's very true. And just more on the reflector side, you know, here are some examples of how you might use that. So again, setting it up on the opposite side from the light. You can use a, you know, a store-bought reflector, or something else that works great is foam core. So the second example there on the right-hand side is just, again, you know, from a art store, from a dollar store kind of thing, some foam core that was kind of broken in half to let it stand up, and it will reflect a good amount of light back at the subject. You can also use, you know, just some household aluminum foil, wrap it around some cardboard, and that's going to bounce some light as well. So get creative with your DIY solutions. Um, and then I think lastly, for equipment, is, you know, this is kind of optional, where a tripod and using that to capture your photos will certainly help, if you, but the thing to note is that the more light you have, you know, the less likely you will need the tripod. I mean, that is a very general statement, but typically speaking, you know, when there's a low light situation, your camera is going to struggle with trying to get that brightness, and shooting it handheld, you might get some camera shake, and I'll show you an example of what that means. But using a tripod, you know, and getting a, you know, a small adapter to mount your phone to, is going to just make sure that your shots are sharp, even if you have low light situation, and if you are doing multiple products, you can just leave the camera there, the phone mounted on there, swap out the products, take your photos, and that can help really make the process more efficient as well. And so just a reminder, the end goal here is to get that, square image, white background, pure white. And the thing to stress is that, for efficiency's sake, getting that in your camera is the best option. It's going to, eliminate the need to have additional steps in, post-processing that can add a ton of time. Because I mean, if you think about having hundreds of products, which, some of you might, that can just take an obscene amount of time. and especially if you have, new inventory, constantly turning over, you need a process that's going to make it really simple for you, and really effective. One example is I've worked with an antique shop who has hundreds and hundreds of items in her store, and imagine trying to photograph all of that. It's incredibly daunting, but this particular person was able to get just a little setup that's like always ready to go, and she takes her photos. It's perfect from the camera. It gets uploaded, and away she goes. So we will talk about some options in terms of, post-processing, fixing the exposure with software, with apps, removing backgrounds. But I want to stress that while that is an option, it's not always the best option, because it can just take a ton of time.
Yeah, and unless you already know how to fix something in post, don't just think, oh, I'll fix this in post, because it's a lot easier to fix it practically.
While it is fun to say, it's a lot of work and time and energy that you don't necessarily need to spend. So first, we're going to talk about how to achieve this look straight in your camera, so that you can just go right from your phone to your website and not waste any more time. And starting with the exposure. So this can be really simple. Your phone will allow you to adjust the brightness, but you might need to just kind of crank it up depending on how much light you are projecting at your subject. And so, yeah, a note about that. So I have an Android phone, and so mine, you touch to focus, and same with an iPhone. That's kind of the most important part. That even in the photography webinars, we always remind people a function that you may not have known is that you can touch to focus, and you should touch to focus on your subject. And then when you do that, you can see from this image a little light bulb, or for iPhone users, I think it looks like a sun, and it goes vertically. But it's a very similar function where you can click, or you can touch that icon and start dragging it towards the plus symbol, and it's going to brighten up the image, because by default, it wants to kind of balance things out. It has its own way of trying to set that exposure. But what we want is that pure white look. And a note about that, you can see if you really looked at that photo, you would notice that it is slightly out of focus. And that's because of the way I shot it. I did it when I was creating this webinar really quickly, and all I had was my overhead light from my living room. It was at night, so there was no daylight option, and I had to manually pull that exposure basically all the way as far as I could to achieve that look. And what happens when I did that was that the camera is essentially lowering the shutter speed so much that, by me hand holding that that phone and taking the photo, I got a little bit of camera shake in there, and that's why it's blurry. So that's where more light and potentially a tripod would have helped in that situation.
Yeah, but basically, if you don't have enough light in the scene for the camera, then the camera has to leave the shutter open for longer than you would like it to. So while that shutter's open, if there's any tiny bit of movement, it's going to make the image look blurred because it's taking let's say a half-second exposure, which involves that wobble.
That's right.
One thing you can do to help is if you put it on a 2-second, if you don't have a tripod, obviously tripod's by far the best. But if you are doing it handheld, if you set a 2-second timer on your phone, then rather than you having it handheld and pressing that button, it just takes out that extra bit of hand movement. So you can hit the shoot button. You've got 2 seconds of just holding it steady, no trying to like fumble around hitting the button and pushing your phone around.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sam. I've never even thought about that, but it makes sense. Makes a ton of sense to use that 2-second timer. I see Daniel has his hand up. If you want, feel free to drop a question, Daniel, in the Q&A or the chat, and we can get to that. Sound good?
And I'm just going back to talking about the focus if you have a tripod set up or you have somewhere you can place the camera nice and steady, if you long press on the object on an iPhone, it will bring up AF/AE lock, which is autofocus, auto exposure lock. And that means that you can then slide up and down the exposure while keeping the image locked, the focus locked on the subject. And it also means once you've taken a photo, it will stay at the same exposure and focus. Whereas normally, if you just tap on your subject and take a picture, it will go back to the default exposure and focus that it thinks that it wants. And I say useful mainly for when you're on a tripod, because if you imagine that if you do have the focus locked, and while you're moving around, you're coming closer or further away from the object, then the camera doesn't know that you've come closer or further away. So it's focusing for, let's say, 6 inches from the object. You're now at 4 inches, so you're 2 inches focused further back than you want to be.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about macro function in a little bit too in the next slide, I think. But I also wanted to mention about turning off the flash. That was kind of our number one point there. Sam mentioned that earlier as well. And I think it's really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, yes, it will give more light, but oftentimes that is very harsh light, especially when we're close up to our subject, trying to take that product photo. The flash tends to be just very harsh and cast some dark shadows along the behind the image, and it's not a very attractive look. It's very detectable, like you notice it when you see it, and it's much more pleasant to have something like this that's just a soft look to it, well lit from all sides. So that's why I always recommend turn off that flash and use other lighting sources.
What you can have on instead, though, is HDR. Set that to on, and that will basically, it'll take 3 pictures, one slightly under, one slightly overexposed, as well as the regular exposure, and it'll squish them all together in camera to give you one picture. And then think, like, if you can't get rid of shadows, or if you have dark sides of the product compared to light, it'll even all of that out compared to just taking a regular photo. So that's something that can help with the contrast. It sounds like Ben's got a tiny little visitor, as daycare's not on today. So what have we got? Yeah, increase the brightness. Like basically, once you've clicked your subject, slide that up and down until the final image that you want. You can play around with it in post. Like you don't really want to mess around with any more post-production than you need, but you might want to mess around with exposure, the shadows and the highlights afterwards. And maybe, maybe you actually want to crush the black point and the contrast a little, so that depending on the product, maybe you want the blacks to look blacker than kind of gray. And saturation and vibrance, maybe you want the colors to pop, which, they would do in real life, but don't quite translate to an even shot on camera. And maybe white balance, if you find that everything's a little bit yellower than you were hoping. But as I say, do as least post-production as possible, because if you even just 10 items, if you have to do post on each of those, that's 10 times the amount of effort than if you just lit the scene perfectly.
Yeah. So thanks for filling in there. Just had a little visit. But Daniel asks, sometimes I take a picture and I move to the next one, but the camera is still taking the first one. Do you know why sometimes the camera does that? It's kind of a tough question. I mean, my guess would be that there's maybe not enough light. So as Sam was mentioning before, when that happens, it means the exposure time is extended. So it's doing a long exposure. But I mean, that could be a really long exposure, but
one thing it could be is if you have I can't remember what it's called. I think it's like live photo on an iPhone. So if you hold down the shutter, it'll take up to 30 different photos, and it'll sort of stitch them all together so they look like one photo in your iPhone. But if you hover on that, you can see the motion as you've moved of it's taking 30 pictures so that you can select the best in future. So basically the way to avoid that, if you just click to take a picture rather than holding the button to take a picture, like you would have done with an old point and shoot camera, just click it quickly and that'll just take the, instantaneous photo, rather than as long as you keep it held, that's going to continue taking photos. Or it could be something totally different that we haven't thought of.
Yeah. Hopefully we answered that. But okay, moving right along to some additional settings. So again, trying to keep the processing to an absolute minimum. Here are some other handy tips that you can allow you to go directly from your phone to your website. And that is to shoot in a square ratio, because even cropping those photos after the fact can be to just add another step. And if you don't have to do that, why not do that? A lot of phones will allow you to select the ratio, the format that you're shooting in, and especially because of the popularity of platforms like Instagram, square format is very popular. It should be available within your settings. Going back to resolution, as I mentioned, phones can sometimes, they can shoot like 12, 16 megapixels. That's overkill for a website. You can reduce that significantly so that, you don't have to do that after the fact. Again, reducing some of those steps. Grid lines, another kind of a small function that can make a big difference especially if you're doing a series of images, a bunch of different products. Having those grid lines can help you kind of keep the product in relatively the same place, right? So that your end result is a series of images that all look very uniform, very clean, and it can just be really helpful. The other one I forgot there was the macro function. So macro depends on your phone as well. That will allow you to get closer to your subject. So it's really good for shooting smaller items, especially like jewelry. where you have to, really get in there to fill the frame. You want to turn it onto macro, because what happens is that if it's not on macro and you're getting really up close, it can have trouble focusing on that subject.
Yeah, I don't think it's a separate setting in an iPhone. If you're using an iPhone,
Okay.
it's basically just hold it as close as it will focus and tap on which part of the image you want to be in focus.
Right.
The only thing with getting that close to something, it would work with jewelry. It wouldn't make a difference with jewelry because the entire object is so small. But if you're shooting something larger, you just want to be cautious of the lens width. So you don't want to obscure the shape of your object by getting super, super close and having a wide lens. If you imagine, like, if I hold my phone here, you can see the distortion where the front of it is huge compared to the back. Whereas if I'm back here, the whole thing is the same size. So don't go really, really close and be really, really wide. If that's not suitable for your object, you might actually need to move the camera further back and zoom in a little bit to give it the actual shape of the product that you're selling.
Yeah, that's a really good.
Rather than everybody thinking you're selling like egg-shaped plates.
Giant iPhones. And Amber asks, what's the best resolution for shooting for a website or social media? That's a great question as well. And I don't know, my rule of thumb, I mean, I was actually just looking at my camera, and the lowest it shoots is still pretty high. Like it was still it was over 2,000 pixels square, which to me is a bit overkill. I would say like 1,000 would be perfect.
The only thing you're gonna have to bear in mind is if you are shooting a scene where you're gonna need to crop it, you want more pixels than you're actually gonna need for the final thing. Let's say you're shooting at 4,000 by 4,000 as a square, but you know that you're gonna be punching in to just that central area. And in the end, you're only gonna have 1,000 by 1,000 kind of thing. But like the thing is with websites is you don't want to slow down your website load time, like the page load time, by having any huge images on the site. And I can't think of any names off the top of my head, but there are plenty of programs available that when you upload to your website, I mean, I presume, I think Squarespace does it on its own. I presume WordPress does it on its own. When you upload an image, it automatically makes it sensibly sized for the web. So that if you've got 10 images on your page, it's not going to take a minute for the website to load. I don't think Ben's free yet. The other thing with shooting as a square, presumably shooting as a square is going to be generally the best, but plan your layout in advance for your website. Maybe, if all images are going to be squares, do that. But you might find that you want everything to be landscape images. If you're selling oblong items, I don't know, baguettes and football scarves and stuff, you don't want that as a square with a whole bunch of dead space around it. You want it to be, instead shoot it in landscape and fill as much of the frame as possible with your subject.
Thanks, Sam. And yeah, one of the main reasons I think that, I'm focusing mostly on the square is that it's not only is it a common format, but oftentimes, it's the thumbnail as well, that because you could shoot it in a vertical format, your display, a photo, let's say you're selling bottles of wine or olive oil or something, and you've got, a tall vertical image, but then when it displays a thumbnail, like on the shopping section of your website, it might just crop in as a square to the center of the image, and you might lose like the top and the bottom of that bottle. So therefore, that's why I was just kind of come back to square being just a clean format. Keeping it within that can just be a safe way to approach it.
Yeah, and if you know that your website is going to do that with the thumbnails, where it's just going to crop, say, the central square of your square or rectangle, whatever image it is, then, you know, utilize that when you're shooting, and, you know, line up for the center whatever it is you want the thumbnail to be. So that in that case, it would be the label of the bottle of the wine. Always frame that in the central square of your square grid that you've put on the camera.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just a quick note too. I mean, I talked a little bit about using one of these soft boxes, and here's an example of how you might kind of light a product within that. So you set it up inside the softbox, putting lights on either side of it, and projecting camera directly into it. And the nice thing about those is, you know, you can soften the light by moving those lamps further away, or bring them in to brighten things up. And it's just a really nice way to get that that bright look, that clean look without harsh shadows. And that's how you do that. And again, the tripod, you know, being set up for this particular example, it would be great, you know, if you have like 100 necklaces to get through, you leave everything and just change the necklace, right? You swap the necklace, and away you go. Snap each photo, and that's that. Okay, so that's taking the photo with your phone and trying to get it as perfect as can be. If for whatever reason you can't, you have trouble with that, there are options, and we're going to talk about those now. So starting with software options. Sam mentioned this earlier as well about you know, adjusting the brightness and contrast and things like that. In this particular example, going from the one on the left to the one on the right, I achieved that look just by playing with the levels of the image. So it requires a bit more of a robust program or platform, you know, that allows for more finite image editing. In this particular case, I actually downloaded and tried this GIMP software. Weird name, but pretty incredible photo editing software. I found it much like Photoshop. So, you know, the learning curve is probably pretty steep. If you have any experience with Photoshop, you know, yeah, I was able to pick it up pretty quickly. But what it allowed me to do is just, you know, turn up the exposure of the image without without damaging the, you know, the look of the chair itself. The subject is a little bit brighter. I mean, it's quite a bit brighter, but it's not unusable. So that was one way to achieve that. And it takes some finessing with the different dials of, you know, brightness and shadows and contrast to get it right. But that is actually a really quick and easy solution. And I didn't even have to, you know, edit out any of the wrinkles. We brightened it up enough that they just disappeared into the background as well. So GIMP being one of them, Photoshop Express. Sam, did you know that there was a web-based version of Adobe Photoshop Express, and it's free?
I didn't know it was free.
Yes.
I didn't know if you're bringing that up because you know how I hate the Creative Cloud online version of all of Adobe's products. And I'm very much more the old school version of all of them, which are still available. And yeah, all of the new ones just do less for the same price. But for those that are just out for, you know, a use every now and then, yeah, I see Lightroom as well has an app for your phone, which I don't think will be free. But yeah, Photoshop Express sounds great.
Yeah. Apparently, you just create an account. It's free, like free Adobe account. And they do have a background remover, which we'll talk about in a second as well. But some apps that are available as well, something like Snapseed or VSCO app. I haven't used any of those before, but I just wanted to throw out some options for your consideration.
And for those that, I mean, particularly if you download GIMP and look at the interface of it and go, oh, mother of God, I'm out of my depth here. The easiest way of doing it is just slide through the pictures in your photo reel in your phone and edit them in phone before you start exporting them and trying to remove backgrounds and all that sort of stuff. Because, you know, what you can do in an iPhone with the post-production is it's very intuitive, it's easy. The only thing that we should have mentioned this earlier, when you're taking the pictures and when you're looking at them in your phone, make sure your brightness is all the way up. Because if your phone brightness is only on 50% and you're trying to expose to your subject while you're taking the shots, you're going to find out afterwards that everything was overexposed, but you were just looking at a dark screen.
Yes, that's something I did not consider.
And the cardinal rule that we should have covered right at the start is clean your lens beforehand. Wipe it on your t-shirt, something not abrasive. It takes 1 second, but if you've got a big fat fingerprint on the front of that lens and you start shooting, you're going to see, once you look at the photos carefully, there's a giant blur across half of your screen or something, and you don't want that.
No, definitely do not want that. Okay, so moving along. So removing background. So again, in this example, I took the same image and I used the remove.bg option. So that's a website that I was able to do that one for free, but they do have some pricing. I think that's how they get you hooked. They give you one for free, and then they start charging you for that. But I got to say, it was pretty seamless. It was awesome, and it looks fantastic. Like, it looks like it really nailed that that cutout. Now, I will point out, I mean, giving them a photo that is very obvious, what is the subject and what is the background, that's really helpful. And Photoshop Express, again, that's another option. Apparently that one's, again, free. So you just create a free Adobe account, and there is a background remover tool there. And Canva is another one. We talked about Canva last week in our intro to Canva webinar, and the background remover is a paid option there. Again, if you have a ton of them to do and get through, then perhaps the paid option is not a bad way to go. But check out Adobe Photoshop Express, and that can help. But again, yeah, having that clean distinction is really helpful from the start.
And if you are using that sort of stuff, like, I imagine you'll find a 90-second YouTube video that is going to show you how to instantly remove a background in Photoshop Express. But it's basically, how would you describe it? It's the magic wand with a little glowing end to it. Just click that on the background, hit delete, and that will take out whatever that color was on the background of the image.
They've actually improved it over the last couple of years, where the magic wand tool actually has a background removal button. So you don't even have to like select all of the background. You just hit the one background, or select subject actually, and it will create a selection of just your subject. And then you can delete the rest, and away you go. It's actually pretty sweet. And that is that.
If you just go back one slide for me, Ben, and show that chair. If you guys can remember the chair that we saw earlier in the webinar, it was, pretty much the same chair, but actually it wasn't, it was like a leather seat, but you know, you're shooting a chair. Do you want to be selling the product as this straight on chair, or do you want to be kind of 30 degrees to one side, 30 degrees up, so you're kind of looking down on the seat? Like, think about the angles and what's going to, you know, showcase your product best. Do you shoot square on like that? If you're shooting something like cookies or whatever, do you want to be down at eye level, or do you want to be top down, bird's eye view on top of the cookie? So flat, straight, angled, you know, think about it beforehand as to what's going to look coolest on your website.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, it comes back to, you know, why that, like, that process and that efficiency is so vital, because what you might end up doing is, you know, setting up that chair shot for the front, go turn it, take another one, turn it again, take another one, and you might end up having, you know, 3 or 4 photos of the same product. And if you've got, you know, even 10 products, that can really add up, right?
Yeah, that can suck.
Now you've got 40 photos that you have to get through and process. So hopefully that was really helpful. And, you know, again, if you need help with navigating any of these programs, any of these apps, even if we don't have, you know, a ton of experience, you know, we're always happy to learn about them and help you through that process, and just make it easier for you. So that's what your digital service squad is here for. That's why the consultations are there for your support as well. And yeah, if we don't have any other questions,
I've just noticed, sorry, that the permissions on that PDF of the slides was set to something weird. So
right.
I'm just trying to change that now. And that last link posted in the chat should work for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, hopefully that was helpful. Be sure to get your application in if you might be eligible for the Digital Main Street Digital Transformation Grant, and book that consultation to find out if you are eligible. You know, we can help you determine that pretty quickly. So yeah, thanks again, and happy holidays. Have a great week, everyone. And we will see you next Wednesday is the Instagram for Business. So that's going to be a great webinar as well. So Wednesday at 10 a.m. Be sure to register for that, and we'll see you then.
Cool. See you soon.
Take care, everyone. Bye for now.